George Frideric Handel was one of Britain's most respected, accomplished and deeply loved musicians in the 18th century. Except, of course, he was actually born in Germany. Handel was born in Halle, near Leipzig, but even from his earliest years he was a cosmopolitan figure. He worked as a musician in Hamburg, then across Italy, in Florence, Naples, Venice and Rome. And it was while Handel was in Rome that he received a visit from Prince Ernst August, brother of the esteemed and powerful Elector of Hanover, George Louis. The prince had a request that Handel should visit Hanover himself. Handel did just that, and he was offered the position of Kapellmeister at the Elector's court. It was a huge honour for the young man. But the problem was that Handel was already in demand. He'd committed himself to musical projects in London, but no matter, George Louis permitted him a leave of absence almost as soon as he'd begun. Handel first arrived in London in the autumn of 1710, and his visit went extremely well. His first English opera, Rinaldo, was a sensational success. It was so adored by London audiences that Handel received an invitation to visit Queen Anne. He struck up what seems to have been a fairly warm relationship with the monarch, who was rumoured to have barely any interest in music at all. Handel returned to Hanover briefly in 1711, but his heart was in London, and the Elector George Louis knew it. He allowed Handel to return to the English capital, but only for a strictly limited time. Of course, Handel stayed longer than the agreed period, and as a result, he found himself out of a job, though it's not clear whether he jumped or whether he was pushed. His newfound freedom allowed Handel to focus his mind even more clearly on Britain. And one of the first pieces he wrote during this time was the Ode for the Birthday of Queen Anne. It's a beautiful piece for solo singers, chorus and small orchestra, and it's sometimes known as Eternal Source of Light Divine, the opening line of its text by Ambrose Phillips. Both text and music were intended not only to mark the Queen's birthday, but also to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht, which had ended the War of the Spanish Succession. The ode presents the Queen as a glorious peacemaker. It's not clear, though, whether Queen Anne ever actually heard the piece. It's thought to have first been performed on the 6th of February 1713, the monarch's birthday, but there's no specific record that it actually was. The following year, Queen Anne died, leaving a question mark over her successor. Catholics had been forbidden from ascending to the British throne since the 1701 Act of Settlement. Because of that, Anne would be succeeded by her closest Protestant relative, who happened to be George Louis, Elector of Hanover. His coronation in October 1714 marked the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty, which lasted until the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. The new King George I was clearly someone that Handel already knew well. And although George hadn't been best pleased by the amount of time Handel had been spending in Britain, their friendship was quickly rekindled. Handel found himself with new musical duties at court, including working as music master to George's daughters. In the summer of 1717, Handel was involved in another royal duty that would culminate in one of his most famous pieces of music ever written. The king had decided that he would hold a concert on the River Thames itself, with music accompanying his journey upstream from Whitehall to Chelsea and back again. Handel, of course, was to write the music for this magnificent event, his water music. He came up with some of his most stirring, confident, unapologetically entertaining music for the evening, and he used a particularly large and sonorous orchestra for the event. He was keen, of course, that his tunes should carry clearly across the water and please the king, which they did, so much so that the king requested repeat performances on 3 future occasions. I've never actually played water music as an adult in a professional orchestra, but when I was a kid, we used to play lots of little bits from the dances when I was learning the violin. That was my very first instrument. And I think it's so nice that all of these tunes that you learn as a child that appear in all of these books, they're so kind of characterful and fun to play at any stage, and then you hear the music later on in life in performance and you realise, oh yeah, I used to remember scraping away on the fiddle, and then you hear it done properly, and it just says something about the quality of the music, that it can kind of be transferred across all of those different levels and really appeal to everyone, just the basic melodies that he's written. Following the huge spectacle of the water music, Handel continued to broaden his musical activities, especially in his operas, which remained breathtakingly popular amongst London audiences. In 1727, however, King George I died. One of his final acts before his death had been to appoint Handel a British citizen. The composer duly adopted English versions of his name as George Frideric. The late king was succeeded by his son, George II. For the new king's coronation, Handel created some of the most lavish, exuberant, spectacular music he ever composed, the 4 coronation anthems. He knew that he'd have some of England's finest musicians at his disposal, including the choir of the Chapel Royal and a large orchestra thought to have numbered about 150 players, all of them in the appropriately grand setting of Westminster Abbey. Just think of that marvellous, stately orchestral build-up at the start of Zadok the Priest, the first of the 4 anthems, and the explosion of sound when the choir finally enters. It's no wonder that Zadok the Priest has been performed at every single British coronation since. In 1749, King George II launched a plan to outdo even his father's famous musical river trip. He would arrange a huge firework display in Green Park, not only to demonstrate his own wealth and power, but also to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which ended the War of the Austrian Succession. And for this huge, never-before-seen celebration, George II would engage the services of architects, designers, military strategists, musicians, and of course, George Frideric Handel, to compose some specially stirring, joyful music for the occasion, his music for the royal fireworks. In the end, however, while George I's river adventure was an unforgettable success, George II's fireworks evening ended up as something of a damp squib. For a start, there was a squabble over Handel's orchestra. The composer wanted to use stringed instruments, but the Duke of Montague, Master General of the Ordnance and the man responsible for the evening's pyrotechnics, made it clear that the king wanted no fiddles. Handel reluctantly agreed. Handel knew there would be a dress rehearsal, and he hoped it would take place, like the real event, in Green Park. In the end, however, it was held south of the river in Vauxhall Gardens, a much-loved strolling ground for London society. The dress rehearsal attracted an audience estimated at around 12,000, causing a 3-hour traffic jam of carriages over London Bridge. But there was worse to come. On the big fireworks night itself, it rained. There were problems igniting the fireworks, some of them went astray, even at one point setting fire to the pavilion where the orchestra were performing. Writer Horace Walpole summed up the fiasco of the evening, describing it as pitiful and ill-conducted, and saying that it by no means answered the expense, the length of preparation, and the expectation that had been raised. He did note, however, that very little mischief was done, and but 2 persons killed. Handel's music, however, was the evening's brilliant success. Just as much as the water music 3 decades earlier, it was grand, exuberant, and ideally suited to the outdoor setting for which it was written. And in his score, Handel brought together popular dances of the times with music reflecting the event's loftier themes of peace and celebration following the end of the war. By the time of his death in 1759, Handel the German had become a British legend. He was accorded full state honours at his funeral and buried in the appropriate setting of Westminster Abbey, where his coronation anthems had marked the beginning of King George II's reign 22 years earlier. He was a great opera composer and a clever impresario too, but the works that Handel wrote for the 3 monarchs who reigned during his time in Britain contain what's undoubtedly some of his grandest, most spectacular music. I think what makes Handel really fun to play as a timpanist is that the musicians that he was writing for at the time would have been part of the military division and not really associated as much with the strings and wind players. The trumpets and timps were brought in, timps on horseback here, so a timp on each side. They'd be brought in to kind of join along with the orchestra, stuff that was already going on, but they'd also do their own separate fanfare and like military drills, so they weren't in the same gang of employees. And because it would have been on horseback, the parts are really simple and kind of just very like left and right, and you can really kind of imagine the rusticness of them, which makes them really, really fun to play. I think the trumpets would say the same thing, although maybe they're going to be upset with me for that, because I think maybe their parts are a little bit more difficult. Learn all there is to learn, and then choose your own path.